And if I know my value in my portfolio is $4,735,000, well, I can get a sense of what a withdrawal rate is on that. All right. The retirement math question never changes. Everyone wants to know, do I have enough? The same question at 43, as it is at 52, as it is right until we retire. But it's not really about, do I have enough? It's about an understanding of how much do I need to support, and from what income sources can I support that? So today, Nick and I are going to walk through some very different distances to retirement, and we're going to model what that could look like when you have a 10-year runway or when you're just on the door of retirement. Somewhere in the middle, Nick and I might have some different thoughts on how much we can withdraw from portfolios, because, the safe withdrawal rate debate is real, and where you land on it can change your plan.
Absolutely. I'm excited for this one because it's a moving target, right, Scott?
Yeah.
There's no one cookie cutter answer that applies to everybody. It'd be really nice if it was. We'd rubber stamp the plan and say, good luck. But we know the market moves. We know our lifestyle moves. Things change. And that's why financial planning is an ongoing process. And so we're going to dive into all the different strategies, how we arrive at that number. And, you and I have both been doing this long enough where we've gotten the same question from somebody in their 40s. And I just had it yesterday from somebody in their 70s.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And the withdrawal rates that people typically think of, they'll have heard that 4% rule in the past, which is never actually a 4% rule. It's just the way it was put out into the world. It was really like a 4.4% rule back in the 90s. This guy named Bill Bengen basically studied markets with the question of how much can we withdraw from a portfolio for 30 years and never run out of money. And so that's what he did. He updated those numbers with more asset classes in his scenarios, and that number's gone up. So we'll talk about that today. And then we also knew about some folks who came out and basically said, well, hold on a second. Like, most people, if you're in a downturn, choose to tighten their belts. And if that's real and they're willing to do that, can they take out more before a downturn occurs? So that's these guys, Guyton and Klinger, and we can talk about them as well. So we'll kind of walk through some scenarios today.
Yeah, and we'll touch on it more as well. But one of the things that I think we've both found to be true is spending doesn't stay the same in retirement.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And certainly, to your point with Guyton and Klinger, which we'll dive into, markets and what we could spend certainly dictate that.
Yep.
But when we put two retirees side by side, all things being true or equal, of a 55 or 60-year-old versus somebody that's in their 80s, their spending's probably going to look different, and we should account for that.
Yes.
Right? Because I think, personally, cardinal sin of retirement is getting to the end of our life, and we have so much money left over. And part of our job is to say, right, your famous saying, like, money is simply a tool, simply a resource, and how do we use it to create and design this one meaningful life? And so the beauty behind all of this is, if we can know these numbers and how they adjust over time, what can we use to live a fulfilled life?
Yeah. And the thing that you're speaking of, like, we're kind of talking about smile in retirement spending, is we spend more in the early years, and then it kind of dips, and then it goes back up when we maybe need more healthcare or things like that.
Right.
I see that playing out with a client who I met with this week, who's about to turn 80. And we spent a lot more money going on trips to Europe and doing other things. And now we're kind of in a phase where we don't want to travel as much anymore. And we really like being home and doing other things around town. So we're not going to be traveling and doing the things that were that extra expense earlier in the years. So I totally see that playing out time and again. One of the things that we see, we actually do have a how much do I need to retire quiz that people can, just click below and we get, but we get that back all the time. And the frame that we give you back is exactly this kind of a conversation around, well, when do you actually want to retire, and what do you actually want it to look like? And so, like, An example that's fairly common these days is someone will have around like 1.8 million in assets and they'll be making, a couple 100,000 in income and they'll be saving, a good percentage of their net worth. I mean, their income every year. And the question is like, well, what happens to those assets? What if in 10 years I want to retire? And so, I just kind of gave a really blanketed, simple assumption of investing 80% in stocks and 20% in bonds. And if we do that, the 1.8 million is going to grow on its own. And then the savings that we have every month is going to grow. And then, 10 years from now, that 1.8 million with savings would have grown to about 4.7 million. And it's like, well, what if we retire then? Is that enough to retire on? So then what you actually have to go look at is you have to say, well, how much do I need to retire? What do I need to live life on? And I give this as an example because the number one thing that we care about for Are You Okay Retiring is not just how much money do you have? It's how much does that need to support? So once we understand that and we say, well, what if you need, $12,000 a month today? Well, at retirement, that would be 16,000 a month that it would need to support. And then the question is like, well, would that be enough? And then we go look and see, like, are you going to be short? Are you going to have enough? If you're not going to have enough, what's the plan? Are we going to choose to not just fully retire, but work part-time? Or do we have more than enough and we can be totally free of working? It's all woven into a scenario that's based on your real numbers with where your assets are held and what you can actually do.
We've talked about it before. This is such a good exercise to be able to run once a year
Mhm.
or as markets change dramatically, right? We know, and there's data to support this when we look at what's called intra-year decline or how much the stock market moves in any given year based off of where, according to like where it finishes, two different numbers. But we know like last year we had almost a 20% drawdown in April. And that's a good time if we're approaching or already in retirement to say, hey, has my spending number changed? And if so, we should probably be aware of that. And we certainly, when clients or folks get closer to retirement, one of the mistakes that we most commonly see is they don't know their enough number because they don't know how much they spend, right? Whether it's, oops, another Amazon package, no judgment there. That is my other part-time job is opening boxes for Mr. Bezos from Amazon, or they forget to factor in healthcare, um, or there's other there's a host of other expenses that we just leave out. And once we factor in all of those, it helps arrive at a different number. So we need to be really clear on that.
Yeah. And the other thing that will happen is depending on the withdrawal rate that you think you want to utilize, that will change how much you need,
Hmm.
right? So that's a really simple example. If we say we need 12,000 a month now, 10 years from now, if I just inflate 12,000 a month by 3% a year, that means I need $16,127.
Hmm.
And if I know my value in my portfolio is $4,735, well, I can get a sense of what a withdrawal rate is on that, right?
Yeah, and when you say withdrawal rate, I think it's also important for us to understand like the framework of really what we're talking about, right? You
Yeah.
mentioned it's the number of the dollar amount we're taking out divided by the assets that we have.
Yep.
And that usually gives us a nice framework or a lens when we talked earlier about the 4% rule,
Yep.
right? When we divide those two numbers, traditionally what we like to see if it falls somewhere in the range of 3.5, 4, all the way up to, and this is where we could have differences depending on what age we're at or how old we are,
Yep.
maybe 5, 5.5, even 6% before we really run into that danger zone, right?
Yeah.
So that's healthy and that's something you definitely should be monitoring.
Yeah. And where you're at in retirement will
Mhm.
mean a lot of different things to that. Like the thing that I think about for the example I just painted, someone who's maybe 52 now and wants to retire at 62. Well, we can paint that picture for they're saying I spend 12,000 a month and that's great. But I think something we'll have to do another episode on in the future is does that include healthcare costs? Because
Well, I'll
you
do
don't
you
get
one
to have
better.
Medicare until you're 65, right? So if you retire, now we need to have healthcare costs, and healthcare costs are really large. So, for a family of four right now, we pay, I think, something to the tune of like $30,000 a year for healthcare costs. So it's like, we just need to be mindful of do we have all the expenses baked in? But then once we have that, by which do we believe is a good withdrawal rate for us to choose so that we can decide how safe do we feel? And I think the other component there that we're not going to dive too deeply into today is just kind of this idea of your hatchet withdrawals from your portfolio. And I call it a hatchet because there's this thing coming for most people, which is Social Security. But when you retire at 62, you're probably going to want to delay it until at least 67 and maybe age 70. So you're going to need to take a lot from the portfolios on the front end, which is going to be big withdrawals. And then when Social Security hits, the withdrawals needed from the portfolio are going to go down. So you just want to be really mindful of that for yourself.
Yeah, and on that same note, I used the phrase last time sequencing. That's the only time I'll say that word today. But understanding how much money we need at a different time or benchmark, in your 60s versus your 70s is one thing. But
Yeah.
to your point on healthcare, I think another thing that people often at times overlook is where are we taking the money out from? Because
Mm-hmm.
if to your point, if we need $16,000 and it's coming from cash, fantastic. That makes it really easy. But if it's
Mm-hmm.
coming from an IRA, ooh, we got to account for ordinary income taxes, and we may now need to take out $20,000 to be able to cover that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And now our withdrawal rate, it just moved from 4.5% to 5.2 or something like that. And so that's oftentimes something that gets overlooked, which could put us in the danger zone of running out of money or depleting it at a faster rate.
Great thing to add that like these withdrawal rates are pre-tax. They are not post-tax. So where the money comes from matters. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Couldn't agree more. Which withdrawal rate are you a fan of for someone who's retiring early?
I like guardrails. I think that really keeps us on track because I think, I tell clients all the time the minute you walk out the door, financial plan's obsolete. Something in your life inevitably will change, whether it's legislation, policy, markets, your lifestyle, spending, something happening in your life. And so being able to have a flexible withdrawal rate for us and the framework that we use with our clients makes a ton of sense to
Yeah.
say, hey, the markets have done really well over the past 15 years. Let's give ourselves a raise. Whether you want to or not, know that you can,
Mm-hmm.
right? With the understanding that not if, when markets adjust, when there's a downturn, let's have that conversation proactively. Let's know that it's there, that the spending is written in pencil right now, that if they adjust, we're going to have a phone conversation. And what it really helps us do too is it helps us tune out the market noise with clients saying that, the market's down 10%. Guess what? You didn't get a phone call. It's not until it hits this number and there's a
Mm-hmm.
cushion built in. And only then, when it hits this number, do we have to adjust temporarily, not permanently. So
Mm-hmm.
I like that. That's something that we go through um, once a year just to see how that's changed.
Yep.
What about you, Scott?
Well, we don't disagree here because I'm a huge fan of the same, so long as the clients understand that we may have to take a cut. But here's the other side of that. Um, versus the old 4% rule, which is what everyone did run on. If you go show them how much they get to take, so like just as an example, I think that if I were to just say on the 4735 of this fictitious person, withdrawals before taxes, right? So 4735 times what we would start with the Bangan rule, you would get to take about 21,000 and change um, before any rate cuts happen. Does that make sense? Now, if instead I just do the more recent uh, amount for Bangan, you get to take 18.5. Well, a cut will be above 18.5 in the Bangan in the Guyton Klinger rules. So it's like if you're willing to start higher and cut down to still more than you'd originally start with, you're good. Now the worst case scenario is if we get into a really bad free fall, you might need to cut again. Right? Really take something out to allow yourself to have the money come back. So I think that people need to understand that and mindfully think through where would I actually change my spending. Or do we want to have, outside of this guise of assets, do we want to have a pool of, emergency funding for us that we could bleed the difference between the two on for a couple years, and it's not that big of a deal for me too? There's lots of ways to solve it. You just need to have your own plan.
Yeah. And then there's also an understanding too, right? That what we're getting comfortable with spending today in our 50s or 60s is going to, depending on where the portfolio is, if we take that guardrail or that glide path approach or that smile, potentially have to change in our 70s or 80s with the understanding that we're spending more now.
Yes, absolutely. Which is actually um, more baked into human nature than you would think when you're in your 50s and 60s. It just kind of naturally happens.
Yeah, I'll,
Um,
I'll tell you a story too. I have clients that are in their 70s. They are both now at a point where they are required to take money out of their IRAs. So they're both eligible for required minimum distributions, and their portfolios have done really well, Scott, over these past couple years. And we sat down, it was about a year and a half ago, and we mapped out everything. There's a one of their grandchildren was getting married, and they really wanted to be generous and to support. They wanted to do some home renovation projects, and they wanted to do a big, big family trip. And we mapped it out, and we spent everything that they could possibly imagine. And you know what happened?
they have more money now than they did before.
Yep, they spent everything that they could think of, to the point where they said, "I think the credit card company is going to calling to collect here. I can't think of spending another dollar." Because as we sat down for, okay, what does this year hold? And their account still grew, right?
Hmm.
And that's really common when you get into your 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't keep
It is.
up.
No.
That's a good problem to have, right?
Hmm.
But I would argue, could we have done more in our 50s or 60s potentially?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The one caveat I would give is if you're trying to retire much earlier than traditional retirement years, these withdrawal rules are not going to be great for you. When you have a really long, I'm saying longer than like 40-year window of retirement,
Yeah,
you probably want to start with a more conservative withdrawal rate.
it's a good caveat. Yeah.
Because you cannot come back from having when you have such a long time horizon. You might want to be more in the threes or the 3.5s and consult an advisor to see what makes sense for you.
Yeah, and I think when you just look at that, logically, if you're retiring 10 to 15 years sooner than somebody else,
Uh-huh.
they have 10 to 15 years of letting their money work for you. You're still putting your money to work, but you're going in one direction with taking money out. They're going the other direction. And we know how compounding math, regardless of, market returns, generally tend to play out. There's a big difference there. And so when we look at these numbers, just on paper, it's like, hey, if we're going to have a longer retirement, withdrawal rate probably needs to be smaller. If we're going to have a shorter retirement, retire later, we could have a higher number.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good point there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the key takeaways are, know your own number, know where you're at today, um, know how far you have to retirement, and then think through the things that are going to come up for you, so that you can map out your own assumptions and make sure you're good to go.
And I look at it too. We dove into it a little bit, but it's, just the reality that as we get closer to retirement, we no
Hmm.
longer have time on our side nearly as much to somebody who's in their late 40s, early 50s, who could be teasing or dreaming about early retirement. Um, I look at that as like a safety blanket for a lot of clients that are approaching early retirement. It's like, if all these things go right, we'll pull the trigger.
Hmm.
But if there's a bad market, the best place to be in that is still employed, where
Yeah.
there's a framework there. There's a safety blanket. Whereas as we get closer to retirement, we don't have as much, and we look at what we call sequence of return risk, right?
Hmm.
Where those numbers they hit home harder.
You promised you wouldn't say sequence again.
I said it in a phrase, so it was a technical term. Good call
Yeah,
there.
no, essentially what that's getting at gets to what Bill Bengen originally looked at, which was basically like, what if you retire at the worst possible time?
Yep.
How long can this portfolio sustain you? And that's really what it's designed to do. It's not designed to say what is the average amount that someone can withdraw and be okay, because that number is actually a lot higher.
Yeah.
Is that when we start retirement, we need to start with the assumption that we need this to last 30 years, 40 years, whatever the model is you're running off of, and make sure that you're okay. And that's where sequence of return risk matters, and honestly, one of the main things that it's built for.
Yeah. And I love that because not only is it back tested and certainly it's been updated, so it's tried, true, and proven. But I think what a lot of retirees oftentimes miss is as their portfolios begin to look different than they did in their 40s and 50s, right? Because generally speaking, we're shifting some of our retirement portfolio to more income based investments. And
Mm-hmm.
when we look at that withdrawal rate, one thing that people often miss is your income is actually your portfolio is producing income for you. I call that monopoly money, right? Whether it's
Mm-hmm.
bonds or dividends, and it looks a lot different. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so when we start to look at like a net withdrawal rate, we oftentimes aren't actually taking out that 4% what we thought because our portfolio's generating that income. And now we're taking out closer to 2 or 3%. So just another thing to consider as we, get closer to retirement, the role that our portfolio plays in that.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is people often think about, for listeners at home, you think about, oh, the S&P 500 went up 10% and I took out 4%, so I got a net of 6.
Mhm.
What Nick's getting at is, and it's what we always look at, we look at what's called total return for an investment. And a total return for an investment is the price movement that was nominal, so it went up 10%, the S&P 500, but it also paid out 2% in dividends. So its return was actually 12.
Mhm.
Right? So you took out 4 and you made 12, so you're up 8. So that's the end result. And that's really how you always want to look at it. You want to treat it in its entirety.
Mhm.
And look at it through that holistic lens for sure. Yeah. Cool, man. Anything else?
No, I think if you're nearing retirement or you're just genuinely curious, there'll be a link in our show notes where you can take that quiz. It's a helpful exercise to go through to be able to see what your number is, how close or how far away you are, the proactive steps you need to take, and I'd encourage you to go through it.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, until next time. Thanks, man.
Of course.